This is a lecture on lesson module 10, the limits of social control. So the last lesson module was about social control, mechanisms of social control. Now we're going to talk about the limits that are placed on social control mechanisms. Here are the objectives that I hope you'll be able to accomplish after you've completed the module. Social control is about enforcing society's norms. I think we covered that pretty well with the last module. We have laws in place to make sure that society is afforded with safety, peace, order, predictability. Um, Laws codify a society's values and beliefs and norms. So whatever a community believes is normal behavior or appropriate behavior is what will be legal, and the contrary then is made illegal. And so laws are the mechanism through which we kind of make those controls and shape and order society. But there are limits in the United States justice systems to what behaviors can be controlled and how government goes about exerting formal social control over any behavior at all. As you know, the U.S. Constitution defines and limits the powers of the national government. State constitutions do likewise with state governments. And the federal constitution actually provides some limitations for even state governments. That goes through the 14th Amendment or the Reconstruction Amendments. So you have the original Constitution, and then you have the Bill of Rights and the Reconstruction Amendments, all of them placing limits on the power of government to do certain things, to control our lives. Um, and these particularly are found through procedural due process rules or substantive due process rules. So, looking specifically at procedural due process, if you remember our study in lesson module 6, we went through all those specific rules that govern government prosecution and punishment of offenders. And so procedural due process is there to give individuals the ability to defend themselves against the government and to require that punishment is proportional and fair. It is the basis for the rules of criminal procedure, which is in and of itself a body of law. There's a book of rules of criminal procedure that if you go to law school, you'll have to study. So it's got procedural due process has its own sort of field, and it's complex, but it is important because it makes sure that government cannot deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without some fairness to that process, without the individual being able to defend against it. It also provides some remedies for abuses of power in the context of criminal prosecution. We learned about that as well. As far as substantive due process goes, here we're talking about fundamental freedoms. So there are certain choices and behaviors that individuals who can live in a free country ought to be able to do without any interference coming from the government. Those are defined, and the legal word is fundamental. So what is fundamental to freedom? Those things are protected by the Constitution. And so before government could infringe upon those fundamental choices, they have to establish a compelling government interest. So it's really hard. It's, I would say, impossible once something is defined as fundamental freedom. The government may pass a law to try to restrict it in some way, but that law will be tested through the strict liability rubric that we learned in a previous module. And so just to go back to the topics of this particular chapter, it goes into rather great depth about gay sexuality, abortion, and the right to marry, and explains how substantive due process worked a change in the laws relating to those three topics. And it goes into enough depth that I'm not going to lecture on it. It's easy to read, and you've probably learned about it in other classes. The one thing it's a little bit off on is abortion, and that's because of the recent changes to abortion laws that have happened in the past couple of years. The Dobbs decision in particular, I don't think is given enough treatment. So I'm going to place a link to an article about the Dobbs decision in the lesson module assignment so that you can have the benefit of that more up-to-date area of law. But these are topics that for specifically the right to marry and gay sexuality, those are not vices. And so it's not something I'm going to expect you to be able to analyze and apply all these means of analysis to. I mean, the matter is settled. Abortion is still now up in the air, but it isn't something I'm going to cover in this class. So I do want you to read the textbook on those topics and understand, were it not for substantive due process, the society would be somewhat different. We may not have protections for those particular choices. I mean, we might, in some states, it might still be protected, but it is the interpretation of the Constitution that has led to the I hate to use the word prohibition, but it's the application of constitutional law that has prevented government from infringing upon these basic rights having to do with a person's identity and choices of whom to marry. And they're coupled with equal protection as well, because a lot of these laws are dependent upon gender and race. So it's kind of connected between the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause. They work in concert with one another to ensure that certain choices are left unrestricted in a free country. But so moving beyond that, though, so we see constitutional law has limited government power to exert social control in certain specific areas. And it imposes these, hurdles of the procedural due process so individuals can defend themselves against abuses of power. But in addition to that constitutional framework, there are other limits on the ability of government to exert social control. And that's mostly what I want us to focus on in this chapter or in this lesson module. If you look at, what is a society's options when it comes to social control? What can it do? Well, it could ban or prohibit certain behavior. So you make it criminal and then you punish it. That's at one end of a spectrum or of a continuum. And at the opposite end of that continuum is to be completely hands off about it. It's not criminal. It's totally free. People can do it as they wish. All right. And then somewhere in the middle lies legalization and regulation of behavior, where the behavior is legal, it can be done, but the government's going to have its hand in there. It will likely tax the behavior. Maybe you have to pay a fee. There are regulations, hurdles that you as the individual have to jump through in order to carry out this behavior. This will make more sense once I give you specific examples. But for each of those options on this continuum, there are costs associated with each of them, harms caused by each of them. And that is the analysis, is a cost-benefit analysis that works as a limitation on government power. The government is making economic choices about whether and to what extent it will exert social control. So what behaviors are worth the costs associated with prohibition? So prohibiting conduct is the most expensive form. It costs money to enforce laws. It costs money to investigate violations of the law, to prosecute violations of the law. And there's costs associated with prisons. You probably heard something about how expensive it is to hold an individual in prison, giving them food, clothing, and shelter for the rest of their lives, where they don't really contribute anything back to society. So that's a huge expense associated with prohibition or banning behavior. but there are certain things we are willing to pay that cost for. And those are mala in se offenses, crimes with a readily identifiable victim who is not consenting to the harm in any way. So, murder, rape, robbery, we are ready as a society to investigate, prosecute, punish those behaviors. Um, and we've kind of talked a lot about that, those mala in se offenses. But beyond those, are there any other types of behavior that we may be willing to pay the cost of prohibition? So next you go to mala prohibita offenses. So these are offenses that offend the moral standards of a specific community at a specific time, not necessarily all communities. So these are lower consensus type offenses. There may be no readily identifiable victim other than just the offender who consents to the harm. I mean, that is the definition of vice there. A consensual act that offends the moral standards of the community, that the community has then defined as an act worthy of condemnation. So, examples of vices: obscenity, prostitution, gambling, drug use for a time, even adultery. I mean, you can probably think of a lot of them. So, are we willing to cover the cost of banning or prohibiting those behaviors? Well, I don't know. That just kind of depends. And it kind of starts with the analysis of something well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's ask that question that's on the slide here. Why would a vice, so this is something people consent to, derive pleasure from, why would we ever define that as a crime? Well, in the past, it was because it offended the moral standards of the community at that time. And that often historically meant it offended the church. So that was the lens that we look through to determine whether or not it's worth it to prohibit that behavior, because some communities believed it was that much worth it to uphold a certain moral or religious standard for their community as a whole and expect absolute conformity to those morals and values of that community. Now it's not so much morality that we're looking through. It's what I've been talking about. It is a cost benefit analysis. We're looking at what harm or costs are associated with the behavior. And it's derived from something called the harm principle that a philosopher named John Stuart Mill proposed. And I've got the full thing here on this slide, so I can read it to you. So the harm principle, that principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number, is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. And so this is written, long time ago, using the male pronouns here, but you think female too. Over herself, over her own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. So we're looking at both genders here, and that's why you want to keep in mind the context of that principle that matters. Okay, so John Stuart Mill's harm principle, when you look at it that way, if there is no readily identifiable victim other than the offender, we would never ban the behavior. We would never prohibit it. It would make no sense to. That is a libertarian perspective that a lot of people share, especially in our country that is very much about individual rights and individual freedom. The government should get its hands off our bodies. It should get its hands off, out of our business. Let us pursue our own careers, pursue our own economic growth and accumulation of property, uninfringed by government regulation of any type. That's a libertarian point of view. As long as we don't hurt other people, government stay away. That was John Stuart Mill's proposition. The catch, though, is that even if there isn't a readily identifiable victim, there are still costs borne by secondary victims or by society as a whole that come from the exercise of certain vice type behaviors. And so society has to weigh in that impact that the practice of this vice will have upon society. And so that's what we do when we apply this harm principle. We're asking these questions here. Who is harmed by the vice? Vices are consensual acts, but they are not truly victimless. So really carefully look at the vice. Who didn't consent to be harmed, but did experience some secondary harm? What is the harm felt by the community as a whole because of the exercise of this vice? Then the next question is, what harm is caused by not, the word I wrote on here is policing, but I want you to think prohibiting the vice, and consider the economic impact by not doing anything about it at all, or even from regulating it. What are the costs and benefits associated with that? And then last, what are the costs and benefits associated with prohibiting it or with regulating it? Look at the economic impact of that as well. That's the type of analysis you go through when you're trying to decide whether and to what extent particular behavior should be controlled by a community. And so to help you along with understanding that, I'm going to apply it in the context of pornography or obscenity. This is covered in your textbook. I'm going to kind of go into it with a touch more depth. So obscenity and pornography, I want you to think, obviously we're talking about, or we're going to limit our discussion to sexual pornography, or sexual obscenity. Is that a word? I want you to know we're all in the same place. We're not just talking about things that are gross. We're talking about sexual behavior or depictions of it anyway. Okay, so what is the harm that is caused by pornographic material? Well, it's going to offend somebody because everything offends somebody. So if enough members of the community are offended by it, find it a breach of morality in some respect, then it's considered obscene, and the First Amendment provides no protection for it. That is the precedent set by the Miller test. It's Miller versus California, I think from like the early 70s. Anyway, it involved a guy who sent like this mass mail out of some sort of pornographic material. I forget all the facts. But in the end, the U.S. Supreme Court said that obscene material is not protected by the First Amendment. So we have to apply a test and determine whether something that is pornographic is also obscene and therefore not protected by the First Amendment. And that test is like a 3-part test that considers what's important for us in this class. It considers the moral standards of that specific community at that specific time. In other words, it's up to a jury. If a jury thinks that it's obscene, and then it's not going to be protected. So it's very localized. I'm exaggerating a bit with that, but you get the idea. Some materials are offensive, and that is a harm. It is a harm to the community. Then there is an argument. I'm not saying I agree with it. That's why I've got a lot of question marks here. Does the use of pornographic material fuel a mindset of exploitation? Because it often depicts that. It's usually exploitive of women. Sometimes it can even be exploitive of children. There is some suggestion that it can lead someone to commit a sexual assault, to go beyond just voyeurism into actually harming someone. However, in that case, a crime has occurred and it would absolutely be prosecuted. So you kind of have to leave that idea out of the analysis. Of course, if it led to sexual assault, whoever committed a sexual assault would absolutely be prosecuted. All right, next, could it fuel addiction? there is a such thing as addiction to pornography that can disrupt families and can disrupt marriages. And those disruptions have costs. It hurts people to find their spouse or um, child, addicted to pornography. That's traumatic for people. So that is a harm, a secondary harm there. It's not just the harm being caused to the viewer of the pornography. And then there's questions about, does the material involve the actual assault or exploitation of a person? Are those actors? Are those, if it's a child, it can't be, um, you could never use a child actor in pornography. It would have to be some sort of computer generated image in order for it to be legal. So there are all of those factors you have to take into consideration with pornography, as the secondary harms that are caused by it. What harm is caused by decriminalizing? Um, I can see I have lots of typos in that sentence. I'm sorry about that. But what we're talking about is what harm is caused by not doing anything about pornography. Well, I've just listed them. Sure, government's not spending any money on the actual prosecution of it, but society still feels the effects of it to the extent that it harms families and breaks up marriages. And if it does in fact lead people to go beyond voyeurism and into actual exploitation, that would certainly be a harm to society as a whole and to real victims. What harm is caused by legalizing it and regulating it, which is kind of what we have now. Um, if we were to, and we have in many, you know, it's complicated, but pornography is legal. If it's defined as obscene, it can be prohibited. So there's some little constitutional issues at play there. But let's just look at it like, what are the costs associated with the way we handle pornography now? So you do have some law enforcement associated with investigating pornographic material, looking at its source, and seeing whether or not it has gone beyond just voyeurism, whether it is involving actual exploitation. And anytime you regulate, or the government gets involved in controlling behavior, there's costs associated with, money, tax dollars are used to fund the investigation and prosecution and punishment. People, work. So there's effort, there is paperwork, there are actual costs associated with it, with the work that is done to regulate or to prohibit a vice. You weigh those in as far as pornography goes. Those costs are real. And pornography is a little unique because it is kind of hard to define what is obscene, to know what you ought to go after and what isn't going to pass the Miller test. So that can have some cost as well. In pornography's primary medium, I'm guessing, but I'm pretty sure it's internet, it's technology. Pornography is spread over the internet. And it's going to be hard for a government to keep up with that technology. So raise the cost there. Cost of investigation would be pretty high if the vice is performed predominantly through expensive technology. There are some economic benefits coming from regulation, maybe not necessarily pornography, but when you regulate certain vices, like, for example, smoking, drinking, gambling, those behaviors are taxed and the taxes are kind of high. So government can generate an income from regulating certain vices. It's not necessarily true of pornography. We aren't really taxing it. I mean, maybe there's some higher tax rate for pornographic magazines you buy in the store. I'm not sure about that, but there is some basis for saying earn money from regulating it that covers the cost of the regulation. So there may be an offset at some points with the regulation of some vices. And then that leads you to your last question. What harm is caused by the absolute prohibition? And we were talking about pornography. If we defined pornography or obscenity broadly, then the harm that's going to be caused by prohibiting it is harm to a First Amendment right. Um, and you also would lose that tax income that would come just from regulating it. So, every situation is going to be a little bit unique in terms of this cost benefit analysis. But I hope you see from my discussion of pornography that the way to weigh those costs and benefits. And I want you to use what I just did as sort of a go by for your assignment for this module. And you're going to do it through a discussion post, but I'm going to assign about half the class to analyze the vice of prostitution. And then the other half of the class is going to have to analyze the vice of drug abuse. And you're going to do this cost benefit analysis that I've just done, applying the harm principle to your assigned vice, analyze it and write about it, post it on the discussion board. And then a couple days later, you go back and look and respond to what some other student wrote about the vice that you didn't originally research. So I want you to learn, because this is the way laws or public policy is carried out through this cost benefit analysis. And I want you to kind of learn how to do it, how this works in the legal world and through our justice systems. If I didn't make sense about some of this, or if you have any other questions, email me. I'll be glad to go over anything again. But that's the end of the lecture, and I'm signing off.